Can you imagine your own brother secretly planning your disappearance, thinking you were out of town? What happens when he calls your girlfriend to boast about disabling your car, only for you to overhear everything and calmly set in motion a reckoning that will dismantle them all? I made sure every one of my betrayers learned exactly who they had underestimated, and I didn't have to break a single law. The morning started like any other at Carver Custom Auto Shop. I'd been there since 6 a.m., already 3 hours into rebuilding a transmission for old Mrs. Hendricks's '98 Camry. The coffee was cold, my hands were stained black with grease, and I could hear Garrett's voice echoing from the office. Loud, confident, making promises to a client about delivery dates he hadn't bothered to check with me first. That's how it always was. I did the work. Garrett took the credit. I handled the difficult repairs, the bookkeeping, the vendor relationships that kept us profitable. He showed up at 10, charmed the customers, and acted like he was running the show. At 38, I'd built this business from nothing after my divorce cleaned me out. At 35, my younger brother had waltzed in 2 years ago when he needed a job, and somehow convinced everyone, including our mother, that he was the real brains of the operation. "Ethan," Garrett's voice carried across the garage floor. "Mrs. Patterson's here for her Lexus. You finished with that brake job yet?" I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over to where he stood with the customer, his arm casually draped over the service counter like he owned it. Mrs. Patterson smiled at me politely, but her attention was clearly on Garrett, his easy grin, his pressed shirt that somehow stayed clean in an auto shop. "All set," I said, handing over the keys. New pads, rotors, and I found a small leak in the brake line that needed addressing. No charge for the extra work. Garrett's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He hated when I did things like that, going above and beyond for customers without charging extra. Said it was bad business. But Mrs. Patterson had been coming here since I opened, and her brake line could have failed next month if I'd ignored it. "That's why we're the best in town," Garrett said smoothly, accepting her payment. "My brother here is a perfectionist. Sometimes too much of one, but that's why our customers keep coming back." The casual dismissal stung, but I'd learned to keep my expression neutral. Mrs. Patterson thanked us both and left, and Garrett immediately turned back to his phone, scrolling through what looked like social media while I returned to the transmission. By 5 p.m., I was ready to call it a day. Garrett had left an hour earlier, something about meeting Tessa for drinks. My girlfriend Kendra had texted that she'd meet me at Torque and Tap, the local bar where most of the automotive crowd hung out after work. I should have known what I was walking into. The bar was crowded, filled with the usual mix of mechanics, body shop guys, and car enthusiasts. I spotted Kendra immediately, her auburn hair catching the light as she laughed at something Garrett was saying. She was sitting in our usual booth, but Garrett was in my usual spot, and Tessa Malone was squeezed in beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. I'd never liked Tessa. She was Kendra's friend first, but she'd attached herself to Garrett the moment they met 6 months ago. At 29, she had the kind of sharp prettiness that demanded attention and the calculating intelligence to know exactly how to use it. She worked in marketing for some downtown firm, which she never let anyone forget, and she had opinions about everything, especially my business. "Ethan." Kendra waved me over, but there was something off about her smile. Too bright, too forced. "We were just talking about you." I slid into the chair across from them, feeling immediately like an outsider at my own table. Garrett was holding court, gesturing with his beer as he spoke. "I was telling the girls about the Morrison contract," he said, not bothering to look at me. 15 grand for a full restoration on that '67 Mustang. Could be our biggest job this year." "Could be," I agreed carefully. "If we can source the original parts he wants. The numbers matching engine alone is going to be a challenge." Tessa leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "But that's the kind of high-end work that really builds a reputation, right? I mean, anyone can change oil and fix brakes. This is where the real money is." There it was, the subtle dig. Anyone can change oil and fix brakes. As if the bread-and-butter work that kept the lights on was somehow beneath us, as if the Mrs. Pattersons of the world didn't matter. "The real money," I said evenly, "comes from satisfied customers who trust you with their daily drivers. The restoration work is nice, but it's not reliable income." Garrett scoffed. "That's the difference between us, brother. You think small. Reliable income, steady customers, that's maintenance thinking. Growth thinking is about premium services, high-margin work, building a brand." Kendra nodded along, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. When had she started agreeing with Garrett over me? When had my own girlfriend started looking at me like I was the problem? "Maybe it's time for some fresh perspectives in the business," Tessa said, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. "New energy, new ideas. Sometimes the founder has to step back and let the next generation take the wheel." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Garrett grinned and clinked his beer against Tessa's glass. Kendra looked uncomfortable but said nothing. And I sat there, feeling the ground shift beneath me, realizing that I wasn't just being criticized. I was being evaluated, judged, found wanting. Well, I said finally, standing up, I should head home early morning tomorrow. Always working, Garrett said with mock sympathy. You need to learn to delegate, Ethan. Trust other people to handle things. Trust other people? The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so painful. I drove home in silence, my mind churning. The house I shared with Kendra was dark when I pulled into the driveway. She was obviously staying at the bar longer. That was happening more often lately. More nights out with Tessa, more conversations that stopped when I walked into a room, more distance in a relationship that had once felt solid. Inside, I poured myself a scotch and tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I really the problem? Was I holding the business back with my conservative approach? Maybe Garrett was right about thinking bigger, taking more risks. I was in the kitchen, contemplating a second drink, when I heard Garrett's voice. At first, I thought he'd come to the house, but then I realized the sound was coming from Kendra's phone, which she'd left on the counter. The screen showed an incoming call, and it was on speaker. She must have answered it remotely somehow, or maybe it was some kind of conference call setup. Went perfectly, Garrett was saying, his voice clear and satisfied. Yes, the job's done. The brake line was cut. Everything went as planned. A sudden chill washed over me. I stood motionless in the kitchen, the scotch glass forgotten in my hand, as my brother's voice carried on. He'll never know what hit him. Literally. Garrett laughed, and I heard Tessa giggle in the background. Poor Ethan, always so careful about maintenance. Too bad he didn't check his own car more carefully. You're sure it'll work? That was Kendra's voice, tinny through the phone speaker, but unmistakably hers. My girlfriend. The woman I'd been living with for 2 years, the woman I'd been thinking about proposing to. Trust me, Garrett said. I've been working on cars almost as long as he has. A partial cut in the brake line, just enough to weaken it. It'll fail under pressure. Probably when he's coming down that hill on Route 9. He takes that route every morning to the parts supplier. And then? Kendra's voice was steady, businesslike, like she was discussing a grocery list. And then we're partners in a very profitable business, Tessa chimed in. With a life insurance payout, we'll have enough capital to really expand. Take on those high-end restorations, maybe open a second location. What about his will? Kendra asked. Leaves everything to you, Garrett said. And you're going to need a business partner to help run things. Someone with experience, someone the customers already know and trust. We'll be the grieving brother and girlfriend, working together to honor Ethan's memory. They all laughed. They actually laughed. I set the glass down very carefully, my hands surprisingly steady. 20 years of working with dangerous tools had taught me to stay calm under pressure, and right now, that training was the only thing keeping me functional. Moving silently, I slipped out the back door and walked the 6 blocks to my shop. My keys felt normal in my hand, the familiar weight of them oddly comforting. The parking lot was empty except for my car, a 2018 Ford F-150 that I'd bought used and meticulously maintained. I grabbed a flashlight from the shop and crawled under the truck. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The brake line to the rear wheels had been partially cut. Not severed completely, but weakened to the point where it would fail under heavy braking. It was actually a clever job, the kind of sabotage that would look like a maintenance failure rather than deliberate tampering, unless you knew what to look for. I took photos with my phone, documenting the damage from multiple angles. Then I sat in my truck in the empty parking lot, staring at the images on my screen, processing what I'd learned. My brother wanted me gone for good. My girlfriend was in on it. My brother's girlfriend was already planning how to spend my life insurance money, and they all thought I was too stupid, too trusting, too weak to see it coming. That was their first mistake. My phone buzzed with a text from Garrett. Hope you get home safe tonight, brother. Drive carefully. You never know what might happen on these dark roads. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, Thanks. See you tomorrow. But I wouldn't be seeing Garrett tomorrow. Not the Ethan he expected, anyway. That version of me, the trusting brother, the accommodating boyfriend, the pushover business owner, ended in that parking lot. What they'd get instead was someone they'd never met before, someone who'd learned a very long time ago that the best revenge is served cold, methodical, and absolutely legal. The next morning, I arrived at the shop before dawn and spent the first hour thinking. Not about the brake line. I'd already called my insurance company and reported the vandalism, making sure there was an official record. Not about confronting Garrett. That would be pointless and would only alert them that I knew. Instead, I thought about patterns. How long had this been building? When did the casual disrespect turn into active plotting? And more importantly, what had I missed? The answer, I realized as I reviewed the past 6 months in my mind, was everything. It started when Tessa entered the picture. Before her, Garrett had been content to coast, showing up late, leaving early, letting me handle the hard work while he took credit for our success. Annoying, but manageable. Tessa had brought ambition. And worse, she'd brought planning. I remembered the first time she'd visited the shop, how she'd walked around like she was evaluating real estate, the questions she'd asked about our profit margins, our customer base, our growth potential. I'd thought she was just taking an interest in Garrett's work. Now I realized she'd been conducting a business assessment. The changes in Kendra made sense now, too. The way she'd grown distant, the nights out with Tessa, the sudden interest in my finances and business operations. She'd been recruited, slowly and carefully, until she was more loyal to the conspiracy than to me. By 7 a.m., I was elbow deep in an engine rebuild, using the familiar work to keep my hands busy while my mind processed. That's when Garrett strolled in, coffee in hand, looking remarkably cheerful for someone who'd tried to do away with his brother the night before. "Morning, Ethan," he said, settling into the office chair. "Sleep well?" "Like a baby," I replied, not looking up from the engine block. "You?" "Great, really great. Had some interesting conversations last night after you left. Got me thinking about the future of this place." I continued working, letting him talk. This was another pattern I'd missed. Garrett's need to gloat, to drop hints about his superior planning. He couldn't resist showing off, even when it risked exposing him. "You know what I think our problem is?" he continued. "We're not thinking big enough. This shop could be so much more than it is." "Could it?" I asked mildly. "Absolutely. Premium services, high-end restorations, maybe even custom builds. We could be the go-to shop for serious collectors, not just people who need their daily drivers fixed." There was that phrase again, daily drivers. The dismissive tone that reduced 90% of our customer base to an inconvenience. Mrs. Patterson and her Camry, old Pete Hendricks with his pickup truck that had 300,000 miles on it, the working families who trusted us to keep their cars running safely and affordably. "That's a big shift," I said. "Would require significant investment, new equipment, different marketing, probably higher overhead." "That's where you're thinking small again," Garrett said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd grown to hate. "You can't grow a business by playing it safe all the time. Sometimes you have to take risks, make bold moves." Like cutting your brother's brake lines, I thought, but didn't say. The morning continued with more of the same. Garrett holding court in the office, taking calls from customers and making promises without consulting me. Making jokes about my old school methods to anyone who would listen. Acting, in every way that mattered, like he already owned the place. Around noon, Kendra showed up with lunch, something she used to do regularly but hadn't done in months. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her purse strap as she handed me the sandwich. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, but she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Thanks," I said, accepting the food I suddenly had no appetite for. "This is nice, like old times." Something flickered across her face, guilt, maybe, or regret. For a moment, I wondered if there was still something salvageable between us. Then Tessa walked in, and Kendra's expression immediately shifted, becoming guarded and distant again. "Ethan," Tessa said with false brightness. "How are you feeling today? You seemed a little off last night." "Just tired," I said. "Long day." "You work too hard," she said, exchanging a meaningful look with Kendra. "Maybe it's time to think about scaling back a little, delegating more responsibility." "To who?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear how she'd answer. "Well, Garrett's been here 2 years now. He knows the business inside and out, and he's got fresh ideas, new energy. Maybe he could take on more of the day-to-day operations while you focus on other things. Other things, like being gone for good, presumably." "That's an interesting idea," I said. "I'll have to think about it." Tessa's smile was sharp and satisfied. She thought she was manipulating me, steering me toward a decision that would make their eventual takeover easier. She had no idea that every word out of her mouth was digging their graves deeper. That afternoon, I drove to the car show at the convention center, an annual event where local shops displayed their work and networked with potential customers. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, planning to show off the '71 Chevelle I'd restored over the winter. Instead, I found myself sidelined and marginalized in my own booth. Garrett had arrived early and positioned himself as the primary contact, handing out business cards with his name prominently displayed. When customers asked technical questions, he'd deflect with charm and promise to have my guys look into that. When they wanted to discuss pricing, he'd quote numbers that were either impossibly low or ridiculously high, depending on his mood. "Your brother's quite the salesman," said Pete Morrison, the collector with the Mustang Restoration Project. "Very confident about what you can deliver." I watched Garrett across the booth, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to a young couple about their Honda Civic. He was promising a complete engine rebuild for half what it would actually cost. "Confidence is important," I said carefully, "but so is realistic expectations." Morrison nodded. "That's why I prefer working with you directly, Ethan. Garrett's got enthusiasm, but you've got the experience. You know what's actually possible." It was a compliment, but it felt like a warning, too. Morrison could see what was happening, the slow transfer of authority from me to Garrett, the way customers were being encouraged to work with my brother instead of me. He was politely telling me that if Garrett took over, he'd take his business elsewhere. How many other customers felt the same way? By the time we packed up, I had my answer. 3 longtime customers had quietly expressed concerns about the shop's direction, 2 had specifically asked if I was planning to retire soon, and 1, Mrs. Patterson, had looked genuinely worried when Garrett told her that I was stepping back from day-to-day operations. On the drive home, I made a decision. It was time to stop reacting and start acting. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. That evening, while Kendra was out with Tessa again, I did something I'd never done before in our relationship. I went through her things. Her laptop was password protected, but I knew her well enough to guess it on the 3rd try. Her mother's maiden name combined with her birth year. Her email revealed months of correspondence with Tessa about business opportunities and future plans. Nothing explicitly incriminating, but the tone was clear. They were planning a life that didn't include me. More interesting was her search history. She'd been researching business partnerships, life insurance policies, and estate law. She'd also been looking at real estate, expensive condos and houses well beyond what her current income could support. In her desk drawer, I found something even more incriminating, a folder labeled Carver Auto Future Plans, containing printed emails, financial projections, and what looked like a rough business outline. The projections assumed I would be out of the picture within the next 6 months and calculated the expected insurance payout down to the dollar. They'd been preparing this for a long time, months, maybe longer. Careful, methodical, and thorough. Almost as thorough as I was about to be. I photographed everything, uploaded the images to a secure cloud account, and put everything back exactly where I'd found it. Then I poured myself the second scotch I'd never gotten to the night before and began planning how to bring it all down. The beauty of it was that they'd already handed me everything I needed. The cut break line showed a deliberate attempt to cause serious harm. The emails and business plans demonstrated advanced planning and coordination. The insurance research revealed clear motivation. All I had to do was document everything properly and pick the right moment to spring the trap. But first, I was going to make sure they understood exactly who they had targeted. Sunday dinner at my mother's house had been a family tradition for as long as I could remember. Even after Dad passed 5 years earlier, Leah Carver insisted on keeping the ritual alive. Usually it was just the 3 of us, me, Garrett, and Mom. This week, Garrett asked if he could bring Tessa, and I said Kendra would come too. I should have realized it was a setup. Mom's dining room felt smaller with 5 people packed around a table that had once seemed roomy for 3. Tessa placed herself directly across from me, dressed carefully for the occasion. A conservative blouse and skirt that made her look like a young professional meeting her partner's family for the first time. The act was flawless. "This roast is incredible, Mrs. Carver," Tessa said, cutting her food with precise, delicate movements. "Garrett told me you were an amazing cook, but this goes beyond what I expected." Mom practically lit up. At 62, she was still sharp and energetic, but she'd been lonely since Dad was gone. Having another woman at the table, especially one clearly trying to impress her, was exactly what she'd been hoping for. "Please call me Leah," Mom said, "and thank you. It's my mother's recipe. I've made it the same way for 30 years. "Tradition really matters," Tessa agreed, casting a meaningful glance at Garrett. "Especially in family businesses, having a strong foundation to build on, while also knowing when it's time to adapt." I kept eating, listening closely. Every word Tessa said carried a second meaning, and she was working on Mom with the same quiet precision she'd used on Kendra. "Garrett tells me the shop is doing very well," Mom said, looking from one son to the other. "I'm so proud of you both for making it work together." "It's been an interesting experience," Garrett replied, his tone carefully measured. "Ethan's taught me a lot about the technical side, but I think I bring something different, a more modern perspective on how to expand." "Expansion is important," Mom said. "Your father always believed that a business that stops moving forward starts fading away. I nearly choked on my wine. Dad had never said anything of the sort. He'd been a postal worker his entire career, as steady and reliable as they came. But Mom's memory of him had been getting softer and more entrepreneurial over the years, especially when she was trying to make a point about the shop. Exactly, Tessa said, seizing the opening. And sometimes growth requires difficult decisions. Sometimes the founder has to step back and let fresh leadership take over. There it was again, that phrase about stepping back. They weren't even being subtle anymore. I don't know about that, I said mildly. The shop's been profitable every year since I opened it. Our customer satisfaction ratings are excellent. Sometimes steady and reliable is better than flashy and risky. Tessa's smile was sharp. But steady and reliable doesn't build wealth, does it? It doesn't create the kind of legacy that can support a family for generations. What kind of legacy are you thinking about? I asked, genuinely curious. Multiple locations, Garrett jumped in, his eyes lighting up. Premium services, high-end restorations, maybe even custom fabrication. We could be the premier automotive shop in the region, not just another neighborhood garage. Mom was nodding along, caught up in the vision. Kendra was staring at her plate, looking uncomfortable, but not disagreeing. And Tessa was watching me with the satisfied expression of someone who thought she was winning. That sounds expensive, I said. Where would the capital come from? There are ways, Tessa said vaguely. Business loans, investors, maybe even unexpected opportunities. Like life insurance payouts. I thought but didn't say. The conversation continued in the same vein throughout dinner. Garrett and Tessa painting grand visions of expansion and success, Mom getting more excited about the possibilities, and me being cast as the cautious older brother who was holding everyone back. By the time we got to dessert, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Mom had been thoroughly convinced that Garrett's ideas were the future, and that I was being stubborn and short-sighted by resisting them. You know, Ethan, she said as she served the apple pie, maybe you should listen to your brother. He's got good instincts, and he's not afraid to take risks. Some risks aren't worth taking, I said quietly. But some risks are necessary, Tessa countered. Sometimes you have to bet everything on the future, or you'll never have one. After dinner, I helped Mom clear the table while the others moved to the living room. She was still talking about Garrett's plans, her voice full of pride and excitement. I never thought I'd see the day when both my boys were working together so successfully, she said, rinsing dishes in the sink. Your father would be so proud. Would he? I asked. She looked at me sharply. Of course he would. You've built something wonderful, and now Garrett's helping you make it even better. That's what family is for. I wanted to tell her the truth, that her younger son was planning to have her older son taken out for money, that the charming young woman in her living room was a calculating predator who saw our family as a business opportunity, that everything she thought she knew about the situation was a carefully constructed lie. Instead, I dried the dishes and kept my mouth shut. Mom had chosen her side, and nothing I said would change her mind, not without proof. Later that evening, I followed Kendra and Tessa to Tessa's apartment across town. It wasn't hard. They weren't trying to hide where they were going, just what they were doing when they got there. I parked across the street and watched through Tessa's living room window as they spread papers across her coffee table. From my position, I couldn't read the documents, but I could see enough to know this wasn't a casual social visit. They were working, reviewing plans, making calculations, pointing at specific sections of whatever they were reading. At one point, Tessa pulled out an envelope and handed Kendra what looked like cash. Payment for services rendered? A down payment on future cooperation? Either way, it was another piece of evidence for the file I was building. I took photos with my phone's zoom lens, documenting the meeting as thoroughly as I could from across the street. Then I drove home and spent the rest of the evening organizing everything I'd collected so far. The brake line photos were the smoking gun, clear evidence of sabotage that could only have been done by someone with mechanical knowledge and access to my truck. The overheard phone conversation established motive and conspiracy. The emails and business plans showed premeditation, but I needed more. I needed to catch them in the act of something that couldn't be explained away or denied. I needed them to make a mistake that would expose the full scope of their betrayal. Fortunately, I knew exactly how to make that happen. Monday morning, I arrived at the shop early and made some modifications to our security system. We'd always had cameras in the customer areas and the office, but I added a few more in the garage itself. Hidden cameras that would record everything that happened around my personal parking space. Then I did something that went against every instinct I had as a mechanic. I sabotaged my own truck. Not the brakes. Those I'd already had professionally repaired, with full documentation of the original damage. Instead, I loosened a few bolts on the suspension, created a small oil leak, and disconnected a sensor that would trigger the check engine light. Nothing dangerous, but enough problems to justify leaving the truck at the shop overnight for repairs. If Garrett was planning another attempt, he'd have to act soon. The original brake line sabotage should have taken me out by now, and he'd be getting nervous about why I was still standing. He'd either try something more direct, or he'd start getting sloppy and making mistakes. Either way, I'd be ready. That afternoon, I made a show of discovering the truck's problems and announcing that I'd have to work late to fix them. Garrett offered to help, but I waved him off. "No point in both of us staying," I said. "Go enjoy your evening. I'll get this sorted out." He left at his usual time, but I noticed he didn't go far. His car was parked at the gas station across the street, and I could see him watching the shop through the window, waiting to see if I actually left or if I was planning to work on the truck after hours. I gave him a good show, turned on all the lights in the garage, raised the truck on the lift, and spent an hour making obvious repairs. Then I turned off the lights, locked up, and drove away in Kendra's car, which I'd borrowed for the occasion. But I didn't go home. Instead, I parked 6 blocks away and walked back, using the alley behind the shop to approach unseen. From my hiding spot behind the dumpster, I had a perfect view of the garage entrance and my truck. I didn't have to wait long. At 11:30 p.m., Garrett's car pulled into the parking lot. He sat there for several minutes, probably making sure I was really gone, then got out and approached the building. He had a key, of course. I'd given him one 2 years ago when he started working for me. The security cameras would record everything from multiple angles, but I wanted to see it myself. I wanted to watch my brother, the man I'd trusted, supported, and defended for 35 years, as he tried to finish me off for the second time. He was more careful this time. Instead of going straight for the brake lines, he spent several minutes examining the truck, looking for the best way to cause a fatal accident that would look like mechanical failure. Finally, he settled on the steering. If he could compromise the steering linkage, the truck would become uncontrollable at highway speeds. I watched him work, documenting everything with my phone's camera. He was good at it, I had to admit. The sabotage was subtle, professional, designed to fail catastrophically, but not obviously. If I hadn't known what to look for, I might have missed it entirely. When he finished, he stood back and admired his work. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's done," he said, and even from across the parking lot I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "This time there's no way he survives. The steering will fail when he hits that curve on Miller Road. He'll go right through the guardrail and down the embankment." He listened for a moment, then laughed. "Trust me, by tomorrow night, we'll be planning his funeral, and by next week, we'll be planning our future." He hung up and drove away, leaving me alone in the darkness with the weight of absolute certainty. There was no going back now, no possibility of reconciliation or forgiveness. Garrett had chosen his path, and now I would choose mine. But first, I had a phone call to make. "Mason," I said when my lawyer answered on the third ring. "It's Ethan Carver. I need to see you first thing in the morning. We need to talk about my brother." Mason Dunley's law office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house downtown, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that gave clients confidence they were dealing with someone serious. At 44, Mason had been practicing law for nearly 20 years, and he'd been my attorney for the last 8, handling everything from the business incorporation to my divorce settlement to the occasional customer dispute. More importantly, he was one of the few people I trusted completely. "Jesus Christ, Ethan," he said after I'd finished explaining the situation. We were sitting in his office at 7 a.m., an hour before his secretary would arrive, and I'd just spent 45 minutes walking him through everything. The overheard phone call, the brake line sabotage, the steering linkage tampering, the business plans I'd found in Kendra's desk. He'd listened without interrupting, making notes on a legal pad, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. Now he was staring at the photos on my phone, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is a serious attempt to cause permanent harm," he said flatly. "Multiple counts, with coordination charges for the girlfriends. We need to contact the authorities right now." "Not yet," I said. "I want to be absolutely certain everything is secured before we move. These people have been planning this for months. They won't unravel easily." Mason leaned back in his chair, studying me closely. "What's your thinking?" "I think they expect me to be out of the picture within the next day or two. They're getting overconfident, making mistakes, probably finalizing their plans for afterward. If we wait just a bit longer, we can catch them with enough proof to keep them contained for a very long time. And if they try again, if they actually pull it off?" I smiled for the first time in days. "They won't. I'm not driving that truck anywhere, and I'm not going anywhere alone. They just don't know that. As far as they're concerned, I'm still the trusting fool who suspects nothing." Mason was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, what do you need from me?" "Legal safeguards for the business assets, first and foremost. I want every account frozen except operating expenses, and Garrett's access revoked immediately. Can you do that without tipping him off? Easily. What else? A new will with very specific instructions about what happens if something suspicious happens to me. I want it filed and witnessed today, with copies sent to the authorities and the insurance company. That's smart. Anything else? I handed him a USB drive. Everything I've collected so far, photos, recordings, documents, timeline of events, I want it all properly documented and stored somewhere safe. And I want you to prepare a complete legal filing. Criminal charges, civil suits, restraining orders, whatever you think will stick. Mason plugged in the drive and began reviewing the files. After a few minutes, he looked up with something like admiration in his eyes. You've been thorough, he said. This is more evidence than most prosecutors get in cases like this. I'm not done yet. By the time I'm finished, they'll have nowhere to run and no way to deny what they've done. What's the end game here, Ethan? What's your ultimate goal? I thought about that for a moment. What did I want? Revenge, certainly, but not the kind that would land me in prison. Justice, but not just the legal kind. I wanted them to understand what they'd lost, what they'd thrown away, what they'd destroyed with their greed and betrayal. I want them to face the consequences of their choices, I said finally. All of them. Legal consequences, financial consequences, social consequences. I want everyone to know exactly who they are and what they did. Mason nodded. I can work with that. Give me until this afternoon to get the paperwork in order. In the meantime, be careful. Don't go anywhere alone, don't eat or drink anything they could have tampered with, and for God's sake, don't confront them until we're ready. I spent the rest of the morning at the bank, making the financial changes Mason had recommended. It was surprisingly easy, a few signatures, some updated authorization forms, and suddenly Garrett found himself locked out of every business account. He'd discover it soon enough, but by then it would be too late. The bank manager, Patricia Vance, had known me since I'd opened my first business account 8 years ago. She was discreet and professional, but I could see the concern in her eyes as I explained what I needed. I hope you don't mind me asking, she said as we finished the paperwork, but is everything all right? These are some pretty dramatic changes. Let's just say I've learned some things about people I trusted, I said. I'm making sure my assets are protected. She nodded understandingly. We see it more often than you'd think. Family businesses can be complicated. Is there anything else we can do to help? Actually, yes. I'd like a complete audit of all account activity for the past 6 months. Every transaction, every access, every inquiry. Can you have that ready by tomorrow? Of course. Should I be looking for anything specific? Unauthorized access, unusual patterns, anything that suggests someone was gathering information they shouldn't have had. By noon, I was back at the shop, acting like everything was normal. Garrett was already there, chatting up a customer who'd brought in a vintage Corvette for restoration. He looked relaxed and confident, probably because he thought I'd be out of the picture within the next 24 hours. Mrs. Kellerman, I said, approaching the customer with a smile. Beautiful car. What year? 1969, she said proudly. It was my late husband's baby. I've been thinking about having it restored as a memorial to him. We'd be honored to work on it, I said, running my hand along the car's faded paint. This is a numbers matching 427, isn't it? These are getting rare. Garrett jumped in smoothly. Ethan's being modest. We specialize in high-end restorations like this. We could have her looking better than new in 6 months. I bit back my first response. Instead, I focused on Mrs. Kellerman, who was clearly emotional about the decision. A car like this deserves to be done right, I said gently. Why don't we start with a complete assessment? We'll document everything, give you a detailed plan and timeline, and make sure you're comfortable with every step before we begin. That sounds perfect, she said, relief evident in her voice. I want to honor Harold's memory, but I also want to make sure I'm working with people I can trust. After she left, Garrett cornered me in the office. You've got to stop undercutting me with the customers, he said, his friendly mask slipping slightly. We had her ready to sign a contract, and you slowed everything down with your cautious approach. Mrs. Kellerman isn't going anywhere, I said calmly. She's been thinking about this restoration for 2 years. She wants to make sure she's making the right decision. She wants to make sure she's working with someone competent, Garrett shot back. Someone who can deliver results, not just promises to be careful. The irony was almost too much to bear. Garrett lecturing me about competence while he'd spent the previous evening sabotaging my truck, but I kept my expression neutral and my voice steady. You're right, I said. Competence is important. So is trust. Mrs. Kellerman needs to know that whoever works on her husband's car will treat it with respect. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes. Suspicion, maybe, or confusion. I was agreeing with him, but not in the way he expected. He'd been trying to provoke an argument, and instead I was being reasonable and conciliatory. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked. "You seem different today." "Just tired," I said. "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately, about what's really important." That seemed to satisfy him. He probably thought I was finally coming around to his way of thinking, finally ready to step aside and let him take over. The idea that I might be planning his destruction would never occur to him. That afternoon, I drove Kendra's car to the storage unit I'd rented across town. It was a small space, just big enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and a few boxes of documents. I'd been using it to store old business records, but now it served a different purpose. I spent 2 hours organizing everything I'd collected, printing emails, labeling photos, creating a timeline that laid out the conspiracy in chronological order. When I was finished, I had a complete case file that would make any prosecutor's job easy. But the legal case was just one part of what I was planning. The other part required a different kind of preparation. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, looking for a specific number. Sean Torres had worked for me part-time for the past year, driving our tow truck and handling vehicle pickups. At 28, he was reliable, discreet, and most importantly, loyal to me rather than to Garrett. "Sean, it's Ethan. I need a favor, and I need you to keep it between us." By 5 p.m., everything was in place. The legal paperwork was filed, the financial assets were secured, and the evidence was documented and stored safely. All that remained was to spring the trap. I drove home in Kendra's car, leaving my sabotaged truck at the shop as planned. Garrett would expect me to drive it in the morning, to take that fatal trip down Miller Road where the steering would fail and send me through the guardrail. Instead, I was going to give them something much more interesting to worry about. Kendra was waiting when I got home, pacing nervously in the living room. She looked up when I walked in, her face pale and strained. "We need to talk," she said. For a moment, I wondered if she was going to confess, if some last vestige of conscience was finally asserting itself. Then I saw the envelope in her hand and realized this was something else entirely. "What's that?" I asked. It's complicated," she said, not meeting my eyes. "There are some things you don't know, some decisions that have been made." "What kind of decisions?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever she was about to say. "Garrett thinks it might be time for you to step back from the business, take a less active role, maybe focus on other things." "Other things like what?" "I don't know. Hobbies, travel, maybe even early retirement. You've worked so hard for so long. You deserve a break." It was masterfully done, I had to admit. She was positioning Garrett's takeover as being for my own good, as if forcing me out of my own business was some kind of favor, and she was delivering it with just the right mixture of concern and regret, like someone breaking bad news rather than someone participating in a conspiracy. "That's an interesting idea," I said carefully. "What brought this on?" "Garrett's been talking to some people, getting advice about business growth and management transitions. He thinks the shop could be more successful with younger leadership. Younger leadership meaning him. He has good ideas, Ethan, and he's not afraid to take risks, to try new approaches. Maybe it's time to let him implement some of those ideas." I nodded slowly, as if I was actually considering it. "And what would my role be in this new arrangement?" "You'd still be involved, of course, maybe as a consultant or focusing on the technical work you enjoy, but Garrett would handle the business side, the customer relationships, the strategic planning." "I see. And this envelope?" She hesitated, then handed it to me. "It's a preliminary agreement, just something to start the conversation, to outline how a transition might work." I opened the envelope and scanned the document inside. It was even worse than I'd expected, a partnership agreement that would give Garrett controlling interest in the business while leaving me with a minority stake and no operational authority. The financial terms were insulting, the legal language was designed to trap me, and the whole thing was clearly intended as a first step toward pushing me out entirely. "This is quite a document," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Very thorough, very definitive." "It's just a starting point," Kendra said quickly. "Nothing's set in stone. We just wanted to get your thoughts, see how you felt about the general direction." "We," not Garrett, not even Garrett and Tessa. "We." She was fully committed to the conspiracy now, no longer even pretending to be neutral. "I'll need some time to think about this," I said, folding the document and putting it back in the envelope. Relief flooded her face. "Of course. Take all the time you need. There's no rush." No rush except for the sabotaged truck sitting in my shop, rigged to end everything the next time I drove it. No rush except for the life insurance policy they were waiting to cash in on. No rush except for the business they were planning to steal. Actually, I said, I think I'll drive up to the lake tomorrow, clear my head, think things through. Sometimes you need to get away from everything to see the big picture. That sounds like a great idea, she said, and I could hear the excitement she was trying to hide. If I drove to the lake, I'd have to take Miller Road. I'd have to navigate that curve where the steering would fail. I'd be gone by tomorrow evening, and she knew it. I'll probably leave early, I said, before dawn so I can watch the sunrise over the water. It's been too long since I did something like that. You should, she agreed. You work too hard. A day of rest and reflection sounds perfect. That night, as Kendra slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the next 24 hours. Everything was ready. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it at exactly the right moment. Tomorrow, my brother and my girlfriend and her friend would learn what happened when you underestimated Ethan Carver. Tomorrow, they would realize that the quiet, trusting, accommodating man they thought they were eliminating had been preparing something of his own. And unlike their plan, mine was actually going to succeed. I woke at 4:30 a.m., just as I'd promised Kendra. She stirred when I got out of bed, mumbling something about being careful on the road, but she didn't fully wake up. She didn't want to be conscious for this part, didn't want to have to look me in the eye while she sent me off to what she believed was the end. I showered, dressed, and made coffee, going through all the motions of a man preparing for a peaceful day at the lake. I even packed a small cooler with sandwiches and drinks, just in case anyone was watching. Then I kissed Kendra goodbye. She was awake enough to mumble "love you" back, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. But instead of driving to the shop to pick up my truck, I drove to the storage unit where I'd spent the previous afternoon. Sean Torres was waiting for me, looking nervous but determined. You sure about this, boss? He asked as I unlocked the unit. This feels pretty heavy. I'm sure, I said, handing him the keys to the tow truck. Just remember, you're delivering a gift. Be polite, be professional, and make sure she understands exactly who it's from. Sean nodded and climbed into the tow truck. I watched him drive away, then got into my rental car, a nondescript sedan I'd picked up the night before, and followed at a distance. The plan was simple, elegant, and completely legal. Garrett had sabotaged my truck, expecting everything to end for me when the steering gave out. Instead, I was going to deliver that truck straight to Tessa's apartment, along with a note explaining that it was a gift from your boyfriend. When she tried to drive it, she'd experience firsthand what Garrett had intended for me. I wasn't trying to cause her to lose her life. The steering would fail at low speed in a parking lot, not on a highway curve. She might be shaken, she might get hurt, but she would survive. What she'd gain was a very clear understanding of the kind of man she'd chosen to stand beside. Tessa lived in a modern apartment complex on the north side of town, the kind of place that attracted young professionals with good salaries and expensive tastes. Her BMW was parked in its assigned spot, gleaming under the parking lot lights. Sean maneuvered the tow truck expertly, loading my sabotaged F-150 and securing it with practiced efficiency. Then he drove to Tessa's building and carefully unloaded it in the visitor parking area, positioning it so she couldn't miss it when she left for work. I watched from across the street as he placed the note on the windshield, a simple card that read, "A gift from your boyfriend," in block letters that couldn't be traced back to me. Then he drove away in the tow truck, leaving no evidence that I'd been involved in the delivery. Now all I had to do was wait. I didn't have to wait long. At 7:15 a.m., Tessa emerged from her building, dressed for work in a sharp business suit and carrying a travel mug of coffee. She stopped short when she saw the truck, confusion evident on her face even from across the street. She approached it cautiously, reading the note twice before pulling out her phone. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see her gesturing animatedly as she spoke, probably calling Garrett to ask what the hell he thought he was doing. The conversation lasted several minutes, with Tessa becoming increasingly agitated. Finally, she hung up and stared at the truck, clearly torn between suspicion and curiosity. The note had said it was a gift from her boyfriend. Garrett must have convinced her that it was some kind of surprise, maybe even a romantic gesture. She walked around the truck, examining it from every angle. It looked perfectly normal. I'd made sure to clean it thoroughly and fix all the cosmetic issues before Garrett had sabotaged it. From the outside, it appeared to be a well-maintained vehicle that someone might reasonably give as a gift. Finally, she made her decision. She opened the driver's door, got behind the wheel, and started the engine. For a moment, nothing happened. The truck started normally, idled smoothly, and showed no obvious signs of problems. Tessa sat there for a few seconds, probably wondering if she was being paranoid, then put it in reverse and began backing out of the parking space. That's when Garrett's sabotage kicked in. The steering linkage failed exactly as he'd designed it to, but at 5 miles per hour instead of 60. The truck lurched to the right, jumped the curb, and crashed into a decorative light pole with a resounding crunch of metal and glass. Tessa was thrown forward against the steering wheel, then back against the seat. The airbag deployed, filling the cab with white powder and the acrid smell of the chemical inflator. She was screaming. I could hear her from across the street. But she was alive and conscious. Within minutes, the parking lot was full of people. Other residents came running to help, someone called 911, and soon the area was swarming with paramedics and police officers. Tessa was extracted from the truck on a backboard, more as a precaution than from any serious injury, and loaded into an ambulance. I drove away before anyone could notice me, but not before I'd taken several photos of the scene. The truck was obviously damaged, the steering linkage clearly visible where it had separated. Any competent mechanic who examined it would immediately recognize sabotage. Phase 1 was complete. I spent the rest of the morning at a coffee shop across town, monitoring local news and social media for reports of the accident. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Local woman injured in mysterious vehicle malfunction was trending on the city's Facebook community page within an hour. More importantly, my phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from Garrett and Kendra. I ignored them all, letting them sweat and wonder where I was and what I knew. At noon, I finally answered Kendra's call. "Ethan," she said, her voice tight with stress. "Where are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "At the lake," I said calmly, "like I told you I would be." "Why? What's wrong?" "There's been an accident. Tessa was hurt. Someone left your truck at her apartment, and when she tried to drive it, something went wrong with the steering." "My truck? That's impossible. My truck is at the shop." "No, it's not. Garrett went to check on it this morning, and it was gone. Then the police called and said it had been in an accident, and Tessa was driving it." I let a long pause develop, as if I was processing this information. That doesn't make any sense. Why would Tessa be driving my truck? How did she even get it? "We don't know. There was a note saying it was a gift from her boyfriend, but Garrett swears he didn't give it to her." "A gift? Someone gave her my truck as a gift?" "That's what the note said. But Ethan, the police are saying the steering was tampered with. They're treating it as an attempt to cause fatal harm." Perfect. The police had drawn the obvious conclusion, and now Garrett was stuck having to explain why his girlfriend had been driving a truck he'd rigged to take me out. "Is she okay?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of concern into my voice. "She's in the hospital. Concussion, some bruises, but nothing serious. She's going to be fine." "Thank God. But I still don't understand how she got my truck." "Neither do we. The police want to talk to you and to Garrett. Can you come back?" "Of course. I'll head home right now." I hung up and smiled for the first time in days. Phase 2 was about to begin. The drive back to town took an hour, giving me plenty of time to prepare for what came next. By the time I arrived at the hospital, the parking lot was packed with police cars and news vans. Word had spread that this wasn't just a simple accident. It was a serious criminal case involving tampering and coordination. I found Kendra in the waiting room, pale and shaken. Garrett was there too, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. When they saw me, relief and suspicion collided on their faces. "Ethan," Kendra said, standing to hug me. "Thank God you're okay." "Why wouldn't I be?" I asked, hugging her back and noticing how rigid and uneasy she felt in my arms. "Because someone tampered with your truck," Garrett said, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "Someone meant for whoever drove it to never make it out safely." "But I wasn't driving it," I pointed out reasonably. "I was at the lake, like I told Kendra I would be. So who was the target? Tessa?" Garrett's face went white. He hadn't thought of that possibility, that someone might have been trying to hurt his girlfriend rather than me. It was a brilliant bit of misdirection, and I could see him struggling to process the implications. "That doesn't make sense," he said finally. "Who would want to hurt Tessa?" "I don't know," I said. "But someone did. Someone tampered with my truck and delivered it to her apartment with a note saying it was from you. Either they were trying to seriously harm her and pin it on you, or—" I let the sentence trail off, watching the scenarios register on Garrett's face. He was boxed in between two equally damaging explanations. Either someone was targeting his girlfriend and setting him up, or someone knew about his plan to hurt me and had turned it back on him. "Or what?" Kendra asked. "Or someone knew Garrett had sabotaged the truck to hurt me, and they decided to teach him a lesson by letting Tessa experience exactly what I was supposed to face." The waiting room fell completely silent. Garrett stared at me, shock giving way to mounting dread as he realized I knew everything. Kendra's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to fear as it all sank in. "That's insane," Garrett said, but there was no real confidence in his voice. "I didn't what?" I asked calmly. "Didn't cut my brake lines 2 weeks ago? Didn't mess with my steering last night? Didn't call Kendra to boast that the job was done and everything went according to plan?" Kendra let out a small, strangled sound. Garrett's face drained of color. I heard the call, I went on evenly. I saw the brake damage. I watched you work on the steering. I documented it all, photos, recordings, everything. And then I decided that instead of letting your plan play out on me, I'd give Tessa a first-hand demonstration of what you had prepared. You could have seriously hurt her, Garrett whispered. Could I? I replied. The same way you could have seriously hurt me? At least she was moving at walking speed in a parking lot instead of racing through a mountain curve. I'd say she got the safer version. Garrett sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Kendra was staring at me like she'd never seen me before, which was probably true. The Ethan she'd known, the trusting, accommodating pushover, was gone. In his place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. What do you want? She asked quietly. Justice, I said, for all of you. That's when the police officers walked into the waiting room, and I knew it was time for the final act. Detective Raymond Hayes was a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of steady, patient demeanor that came from 20 years of investigating cases where families turned on one another. He'd been asking questions for the past hour, calm, methodical ones that built a timeline and pinned down facts. And now he was ready to hear my account. We sat in a conference room at the police station, all four of us gathered around a scarred wooden table beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Garrett slumped in his chair, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Kendra was pale and silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tessa had been released from the hospital with a mild concussion and was now coming to terms with the fact that her boyfriend had put her in serious danger. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Mr. Carver, Detective Hayes said, glancing at his notes. You're claiming that your brother tampered with your vehicle on 2 separate occasions with the intention of causing you fatal harm, and that your girlfriend and Ms. Malone were aware of this plan and took part in it. That's correct, I said calmly, and I have evidence to support every aspect of that allegation. I opened the briefcase I'd brought and began laying out documents on the table. Photos of the cut brake line, time-stamped and dated. Screenshots of the text messages between Kendra and Tessa discussing business opportunities and future plans. Printouts of Kendra's internet search history showing her research into life insurance policies and estate law. Hey, this is the initial sabotage, I said, pointing to the brake line photos. Discovered on October 15th after I overheard my brother bragging to my girlfriend about how the job was done and the brake line was cut. Detective Hayes examined the photos carefully. You didn't report this to police at the time? I wanted to gather more evidence first. I suspected there was a larger conspiracy, and I was right. I pulled out my phone and played the recorded conversation I'd captured 2 nights ago. Garrett's voice clearly audible as he described sabotaging the steering linkage and predicted that I'd go right through the guardrail and down the embankment. The room fell into complete silence as the recording played. Garrett's lawyer closed his eyes and slowly shook his head. Tessa stared at her boyfriend with a mix of horror and revulsion. Kendra looked like she was about to lose her composure. This recording was made without my client's knowledge or consent, Garrett's lawyer said quickly. It may not be admissible in court. Actually, Detective Hayes said, since it was recorded on Mr. Carver's own property using his own security system, it's perfectly admissible. Please continue, Mr. Carver. I spread out the business plans and financial projections I'd found in Kendra's desk. This lays out the motive. They were planning to take over my business after I was out of the picture, using the life insurance payout as startup capital. The timeline shows they'd been working toward this for at least 6 months. These are just rough notes, Kendra said, speaking for the first time in an hour. We were just exploring possibilities. It doesn't mean we plan to hurt anyone. Really? I pulled out the printed emails between her and Tessa. Because this message from you to Ms. Malone says, and I quote, G says it has to look like an accident, no other way to make it work cleanly. What did you think that meant? Kendra's face crumpled. I didn't think he would actually. You didn't think he would actually take me out? I asked. Then what did you think he meant when he called you to say the brake line was cut and everything went as planned? I thought it was just talk, just fantasy or venting or something. I never believed he would really go through with it. But you researched my life insurance policy anyway. You calculated the payout down to the dollar. You made plans for how to spend the money after I was gone. Detective Hayes was writing rapidly, his expression tightening with each detail. Mr. Carver, can you walk me through what happened yesterday morning? How did your truck end up at Ms. Malone's apartment? I had it towed there, I said evenly. After I discovered the steering tampering, I realized my brother expected me to drive that truck and be taken out when the steering failed. Instead, I decided to let Ms. Malone experience what he had planned for me. You deliberately put someone in danger? The detective asked. I put someone who was part of a plot to eliminate me into the same situation they had arranged for me. The difference is, she was moving at 5 miles per hour in a parking lot instead of 60 on a mountain road. That's not the same level of risk. Tessa finally spoke. I didn't know, she said, staring at Garrett with open revulsion. I swear I didn't know he was actually trying to end your life. I thought we were just talking about business options, maybe buying you out or convincing you to step aside. Is that why you researched the best ways to disable brake lines? I asked, pulling out another printed email. Is that why you and Kendra discussed the timeline for implementation and the need to move quickly before E gets suspicious? Tessa's mouth opened and closed without a sound. There was no way to make those messages seem harmless. I think we've heard enough, Detective Hayes said, closing his notebook. Garrett Carver, you're being taken into custody for serious charges related to intentional harm and coordinated tampering. Kendra Fulton and Tessa Malone, you're being taken into custody for their roles in planning and assisting. The next few minutes were chaos. Garrett's lawyer argued about procedure and evidence. Kendra cried, insisting she never wanted anyone seriously hurt. Tessa demanded to call her own attorney, claiming she'd been misled and manipulated. I sat quietly in the middle of it all, watching as 3 people who had planned my disappearance were let out. Detective Hayes stayed behind to finish his paperwork, and when the room finally cleared, he looked at me with something close to respect. That was some impressive work, he said. Most people would have called us as soon as they found the first sign of tampering. Most people don't have a brother undermining them for 2 years and a partner secretly planning their removal for 6 months, I replied. I needed to be sure I had enough proof to make it all stick. Well, you've got that. Between the physical evidence, the recordings, and the documented conspiracy, the prosecutor should have no trouble getting convictions on all counts. Detective Hayes finished his notes and stood up. You're free to go, Mr. Carver. We'll need you to testify when this goes to trial, but for now, you can get back to your life. I walked out of the police station into the afternoon sunlight, breathing deeply for the first time in weeks. The parking lot was full of news vans and reporters, but I ignored their shouted questions and walked straight to my rental car. My phone was buzzing with messages from customers, employees, friends, and family members who'd heard about the arrests. My mother had left 3 voicemails, her voice progressing from confusion to anger to heartbreak as she processed what her younger son had done, but I didn't listen to the messages. Not yet. Instead, I drove to my shop where I found Sean Torres waiting with the keys to the tow truck and a concerned expression. Everything okay, boss? He asked. Everything's perfect, I said, taking the keys. Thanks for your help this morning. You did exactly what I needed you to do. What happens now? I looked at the shop I'd built from nothing, the business I'd nearly lost to the greed and betrayal of people I'd trusted. It would survive this. It would thrive, actually, without Garrett's undermining influence and grandiose schemes. Now we get back to work, I said. We've got cars to fix and customers to serve. Mrs. Kellerman's Corvette isn't going to restore itself. Sean grinned and headed back into the garage. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of tools and engines and honest work being done by people I could trust. Then I walked into my office, sat down at my desk, and picked up the phone to call Mrs. Kellerman. She deserved to know that her husband's car would be in good hands. As I dialed her number, I could hear the police sirens fading in the distance, carrying away the last remnants of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life. But I was still here. My business was still here. And the people who'd underestimated Ethan Carver had learned, far too late, exactly who they'd been dealing with. The phone rang once, twice, and then Mrs. Kellerman's voice came on the line. Hello, Mrs. Kellerman, I said, leaning back in my chair and smiling. This is Ethan Carver. Yeah, I wanted to let you know that we're ready to start work on your husband's Corvette.